Shooting the Breeze with Lady Liberty. I am Lady Liberty, or Kate Fantanel, and I have a very special guest today. I have so many amazing people that I've met through the Liberty movement, and this guest I've been so excited about. I've been planning it for a few months now. He's been busy traveling across the United States of America. His name is Mike ter Maat. He is a Libertarian presidential candidate nominee. He's an Austrian economist. He was a former police officer. He's worked in the White House in economics, and he's here today joining us to have a chat about libertarianism, the USA, and my country, Australia. Very close friends, very good mate. So, Mike, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's a great joy to be with you. I've been looking forward to it too. And thank you for everything that you do down under in terms of trying to keep your government accountable and on the rails. We have been observing that your government is in no better shape than ours. So I know that you have your hands full.
We do have our hands full with fighting a big censorship battle at the moment between Twitter, now X, and the Australian government. They want to censor social media platforms. The Prime Minister of Australia even wants to ban memes and satirical political content. That is how far Australia has fallen under this far left government. It's scary what's happening here. But let me just ask you, Mike, where are you in the world at the moment?
I am in Syracuse, New York. It's a major town in the north central New York State, which is, of course, a state of probably 20 million people in the northeastern part of the United States. I am traveling currently from, if anyone out there knows New York geography, I'm in the midst of traveling from Buffalo to Poughkeepsie on my way to New York City. We were busy today collecting signatures in Buffalo because we need to collect 60,000, well, legally 45,000 signatures to ensure that our party, the Libertarian Party, will be on the ballot in the presidential election in November. We are already on the ballot in something like 47 states. We have a couple to go. New York is our biggest challenge. And so we're spending a lot of time doing that. And tomorrow I have the pleasure of interviewing a good buddy of mine. And then on Sunday, we have more ballot access petitioning for signatures. And then we have a big party Sunday night to raise money for the local Libertarian Party. So it's an important weekend.
Fantastic. Well, I am in Townsville, Queensland. Have you ever been to Australia, Mike? I saw you've been to 35 countries. Is Australia on there?
I have not been to Australia. It is a major shortcoming. I consider myself quite junior in my international travel because I have not been to Australia, and I feel badly about that. My wife went to Australia and New Zealand sometime probably year after next. I'm kind of hoping that 2026 or 2027 at the latest. Is there a particular time to come visit? What's the best time to visit you?
It depends if you like the heat or not. It gets very hot in Australia in our summers, which is the opposite time to your winters, of course. So if you don't mind the heat, if you're not scared of scary animals or getting taken by a croc, which is very common up in this part of the world, northern Queensland, there's someone taken by a crocodile every week almost.
Well, I've lived my life at this point, so I can afford a little bit of risk. I've already put the children through college, so I'm allowed to take a risk here or there. When's your next national election? Because I think it would be great fun to visit during that.
Good question. So we don't have set federal elections. It's whenever the government decides to call them, but it could be any time within the next year. So we can't wait. We need to get rid of this government. I feel like there's a lot of similarities between your politics and our politics. We have a duopoly here. We have Labor and Liberal, which is like your Democratic Party, and the GOP. They're both as bad as each other. They're both authoritarian. They both trampled all over our civil liberties during the pandemic. You might have seen that Australia was closed to the world for quite a long time. Western Australia, where I lived, the border was closed for 2.5 years. You had to get 3 injections to be considered vaccinated and able to go to work and travel. They closed down all of society, made us show our vaccine passport, even to buy alcohol at one stage. So that's just how bad it got down under during those terrible years. Where were you during all of this? Were you in Florida working for the police at that time?
I was in Florida. I was a police officer at the time. It was a very strange time, and I was running for Congress during much of that time. And as you might imagine, these issues were front and center during our congressional campaign. We were spending a great deal of time complaining about the extent to which our governments were requiring vaccines, requiring organizations to mandate that vaccines be taken, or you would either lose your job or your organization would lose its relationship to the government, all of which had huge financial ramifications. So it was coercion of the highest magnitude. And we had many of the same problems that you did. Our federal government was shutting down discussions of certain treatments, medical protocols for handling the disease. It was a very, very unfortunate time. And of course, now we know as well that agencies of our federal government suppressed information about the vaccines themselves, both in terms of how it was developed, side effects, the absence of certain testing, and a general unawareness of some of the most fundamental biological mechanisms involved. So it was an extremely unfortunate time. And we had and by the way, as a registered libertarian, the entire time that I was a police officer, we had any number of weird discussions between us officers and our leadership. I was extremely proud of the officers with whom I worked and their willingness to stand up against our leadership and many of the strange things that they would ask us to do. We would often develop compromises where we were asked, go out and find this group. We've heard that there's 20 people at a swimming pool. The governor doesn't want there to be more than 10 people gathered at any place at any point in time. And so the policy is to shut this down. So we would compromise and we would go out to some of these places and we would say, just what I told you, the governor believes this and this. And people would say, oh, this is terrible. We have to shut down our party. And I would say, don't mishear me. I'm telling you that the governor doesn't like it when more than 10 people are gathered at a place like a swimming pool. I personally am going to get back in that ugly car and drive away to the next swimming pool and pass out the same advice. So after I'm gone, whatever happens is going to happen. But that's how we would compromise in some of these battles that we would have with leadership. Is as a matter of employment, we would agree to pass on your messaging, but enforcing this stuff and the county and the state and the city eventually agreed. That's probably as much as you can ask most officers. They were lucky they got us to even distribute the message, right? As a matter of an advisory service. So those were some very, very weird times. And I fear, and I'm interested in your reaction to this, I fear that there were two lessons learned, or maybe one lesson learned in two different ways by the people involved, one party being the government and one party being the rest of us. I fear that the government learned that it can make us do some weird things. It learned how to make us do some weird things. It learned in what ways, how to communicate. In some ways it's easy, and in some ways there's a challenge to manipulating millions and millions and millions of people into doing what it is you want them to do. But the government has learned a great deal. And the other lesson is exactly the same. The rest of us have learned that the government can make us do some weird things. And I'm interested in your reaction because it's my feeling that the next time this happens, I don't know what that's going to look like, right? I don't know if the next time this happens is going to be a virus or a disease of a different kind, or if it's going to be climate catastrophe being used as political leverage against us for some weird, or some other disaster, right? There's always a disaster around the corner. What I fear is that the government is going to come on even stronger, having learned these lessons, right? And I wonder whether we, being everybody else, if our population has learned the lessons that we need to learn, that you cannot trust your government to be acting in your interests, both because many politicians are just abjectly incompetent and don't understand the data that they're looking at and operate out of fear, and because so many politicians operate with a completely different set of values than you do, just have different principles, different way of looking at the world, operate not in your interest, but in their own, in order to collect power to themselves, build their own control, have not much interest in your civil liberties or your ability to lead your life by your own standards, for you to make decisions for yourselves. And I wonder whether we've learned our lessons.
Well, that's what the big test for libertarians is, isn't it? It's wakening people up to that idea that the government is not our master. We should have control over our own lives or over our own bodies. So elections are an important test, and testing the waters and seeing where the people are politically. So your election coming up, I fear, is going to be a big test of how far the libertarians have come, taking into account what's happened the last few years. And what's the mood like on the ground? I see a lot of talk about third parties, like this is a real chance for third parties. You've got RFK in the race and then the Libertarian Party as well. Are people fed up with the duopoly enough for it to make a difference, taking into account that your electoral system makes it very hard, same in Australia, it makes it very hard for minor parties to get up, even to get on the ballot. It's a huge, expensive resources. You need those boots on the ground, and it's very hard to get people mobilized sometimes. There's a lot of keyboard warriors out there, especially in the libertarian world on Twitter. I've seen some of the comments and the things about you being a cop and you can't trust cops, but that story you just told about passing out the message and not enforcing these laws, that's really great to hear. So this election, what's the feeling? What's the mood in the Libertarian Party, and how are you feeling as a candidate?
It's very stressful, and we don't know exactly how it's going to go. That's the most honest that I can be. It is a big opportunity. I do think the most Americans are waking up to the idea that that many of our biggest problems are the result of bad public policy, and waking up to the idea that you can't trust politicians. But having said that, connecting the dots, as you obviously have, that the two parties in our nation as well as yours have grown together, and that there is a growing sense of authoritarianism that comes out of that. I don't know that all those dots have been connected sufficiently yet. I did spend today, for example, collecting signatures for our petition to gain ballot access in the state, and I was amazed by the extent to which people answered me by saying they are upset about the way things are going, but that means they're doubling down on the importance of electing their favorite politician within the duopolistic system. In other words, they would say, yeah, it's a horrible situation we're in. I'm working so hard to make sure Joe Biden wins re-election. It's a horrible system we're in. We really need Donald Trump back in office. And I just found that so fascinating, because I really am so optimistic that Americans are making progress, and then you hear these answers and it can be a little bit discouraging. As an analytic prospect, we know this is where authoritarianism comes from in a democracy. We know it grows out of a combination of existing parties, existing political structures, leaving behind their prior agenda, what had been traditionally their agenda. And in our examples, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, neither party pursues the political agenda they used to, and rather pursues leveraging fear, right? Each of our parties has adopted as its number one priority nothing more, nothing less than keeping the other side out of power. That is the great bulk of their political agenda, claiming the other side is a threat to democracy. That what you really have to fear is not the loss of your civil liberties. What you really have to fear is that other idiot coming to power. And I am here to save you. I am here to protect you, right? That is the common theme. And it is clear that both parties operate with the same playbook. Both parties have left behind their agenda. They both make the same claims about each other. As I'm sure you're well aware, it is great sport for many in the United States to claim that Donald Trump is a major threat to democracy, about which much can and has been said that is probably true. However, it is not true that he invented this concept, that, that he's the one that came up with these ideas, right? This idea of, well, the election was stolen. Hillary Clinton came up with that idea before Donald Trump did, and before her, there were plenty of politicians who had come up with it. It grows louder and becomes more sophisticated, more complicated, and more accepted within their respective parties. And so for this reason, I fear that in the next cycle, it'll be even worse if Donald Trump wins. There's no reason not to believe the Democratic Party, Joe Biden probably in particular, will claim that something that caused this weird outcome that was somehow inappropriate. And so I see us heading down this path of authoritarianism that is out of alignment with American values, out of alignment with reality in many cases, and certainly out of alignment with the way that you would want a pluralistic democracy to work. Both parties leading to increasing proportions of our resources they're willing to spend, borrowing money and creating inflation as though no one cared, right? No matter how Americans react to it. It just, all of what used to be parts of the basic American political landscape have gone out the window. Nobody cares about any of those elements anymore. It's just all about accusing the other side of being a threat.
Very similar in Australia, but the difference is you guys have a constitution, a Bill of Rights that is meant to protect you from authoritarian governments. I'm a shooter. I'm a big fan of your Second Amendment. Australia has the most tyrannical gun laws in the world. You might be aware of that. We do still have guns, but it's very difficult to get. It's very difficult to keep them in the state of Western Australia, where I've just fled because they've introduced crazy gun laws, limiting how many we can own based on an arbitrary number. I can only own 5 firearms now, for example. I have a collection at home with my dad in South Australia that I'm set to inherit. I can't live there because they won't let me own guns, because apparently it's public safety threat if peaceful people own too many guns. That's what's happening in that state. So I look to America as a beacon of liberty. You were founded on libertarian principles. I listened to a podcast and you say libertarians are the philosophical descendants of those who wrote your constitution. What the bloody hell has happened? What's going on?
Well, listen, you do flatter our nation by pointing out that we have a Bill of Rights. Unfortunately, we live in a post-constitutional nation. Our politicians have effectively left behind the Constitution. We're left with a number of political structures that grew out of what used to be a constitutional democracy. We have a Supreme Court that functions, in some cases in weird ways. And, we have all the trappings. We have the institutions, at least by name. But adherence to certainly the spirit of the Constitution is gone. And increasingly, I would argue that even adherence to what the previous generation understood the Constitution to represent is being left by the wayside with each succeeding generation. It just is absolutely accelerating. And don't see any end in sight, right? You know, it was a dozen years ago that President Obama said famously here, I don't have the ability to unilaterally make these decisions. It doesn't matter what the topic was. The particular topic was an immigration at the moment. And then on the other side of the election, decided to do exactly that after having lectured us. A constitutional law professor was his prior career before going into politics, lecturing us on how he didn't have the unilateral authority to take care of the immigration problem in the way that people were asking him to do so. A handful of people, many of us did not want him to take the action that he did, but his party was beating on him, and he was using this as leverage. You know, I need the Congress to go along with me because I don't have the authority to take care of this problem on my own. On the other side of the election, he decided, you know what? I do have the power, and I'm going to wield it. And this was just one of many turning points. You know, every time one of these things happens, we think, well, that was a huge turning point. But then you look back and you realize there's been 6 others since then, right? It's just accelerating in a way that is hard to anticipate. It's quite literally breathtaking. So, you know, thank you for pointing out that we have a Bill of Rights, and the First Amendment, the protection of free speech and our access to free association. Who would have thought that the government of the United States would be caught red-handed influencing publications, online publications, and not just influencing as in calling them up, which is a time-honored tradition, calling up journalists and saying, you know, I really wish you would run an article about this, or I don't agree with the way you see things. I'm upset about it. That, I suppose one could argue the government shouldn't even be doing that, but that's been, 250 years, right? But actually telling these organizations topics that they couldn't cover. And then within topics, specifics that were just concepts that they weren't allowed to platform. Wow. And then caught red-handed and then didn't stop. Amazing. Just absolutely amazing. So you have to really wonder, what is the next step? What is the next shoe to fall? And, this is a creature apparently wearing 50 shoes, because we keep saying, well, that next shoe to fall, that's it. What more could happen? And then all of a sudden you see the White House, for example, contemplating a new sub-agency in the Justice Department with deciding what it is our relationship should be with journalistic organizations and what the topic should be that they're not allowed to discuss. This after being caught red-handed doing something that we would all agree as Americans and Democratic, lowercase d, Democrats around the world, is completely inappropriate for a pluralistic democracy, a constitutional democracy. And yet they just continue apace. There is no punishment. There's no guardrails. There's nothing to hold them back.
Yeah, we just had Anzac Day earlier this week, which is a big national day for us. It's when we went to Gallipoli on behalf of the British, and our soldiers were sent into a disastrous military situation. A lot of people were killed, but we had that Anzac spirit, which we talk about. They were fighting for our freedoms and right to say what we like and be free. And it was just, to me, so hypocritical of these politicians at these big events on Thursday, saying, yes, we respect our diggers who fought for our freedoms. At the same time, they're introducing legislation to ban what we say online, to censor us, to shut us down, to ban political freedom of expression. So it's just, to me, I sit here and I despair for the future of our country and the future of liberty, because it's being trodden on everywhere you look. Liberal democracies, you look at what happened during the pandemic, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, Australia. We were more tyrannical than China. We had people locked in their homes in Melbourne, Victoria. So you're sitting here thinking, has the West fallen? Are we really the free people that we proudly proclaim to be, that we use an excuse to invade other countries to bring freedom? Are we really that anymore? I don't think that we are. What do you think, Mike?
No, I don't think that we are. This whole idea, in the United States, politicians are very fond of selling us this concept that you came very close to alluding to, American exceptionalism, right? The idea that the United States stands in some sense apart from, but in a very real sense in the minds of politicians, above other democracies, other nations, whether they're democratic or not, and should have broad power to make decisions for other people and not be held back by what other people would consider international norms of behavior. That is from which these politicians would argue, that is what it is from which we need to be accepted, right? We need to be accepted from international norms of behavior, particularly when it comes to war. Because, yes, as you said, spreading freedom. But I think it's important to point out that it comes from a deeper place than just freedom. It comes from a deeper place in certainly the American side by American politicians, that in some sense there's an ethical, a moral underpinning that we not only push freedom, but we push freedom because it's the right thing to do, and we understand it better, and we understand how to promulgate it, how to use it, and we understand the benefits. And so therefore, we are the appropriate arbiter of that cost-benefit analysis. And so if there are costs associated with it in terms of lives or anything else, we're the ones that should be making that decision. Wow. Because as a libertarian would understand it, in my view, libertarianism has a couple of different sides, if you'll bear with me for just a moment. There is an efficiency side, which is to say, if you're a Hayek fan, right, the government doesn't have the ability to process information in a way that would allow it to make decisions for you that are better than the decisions you can make for yourself. In a corporate sense, in an economic sense, in a personal sense, your life is going to be better if you make your own decisions, because you're going to be able to process information, you're going to be smarter, you understand your own goals, your own objectives, and what's better for you. That's one side, an efficiency side. But I would argue that there's another side, and it goes something like this. This will sound weird, but work with me here. Just imagine that socialism works. Imagine an ulterior universe in which socialism worked really well, that the government was able to make decisions for you that are better than the decisions you can make for yourself, that Hayek was wrong, that the government is able to process all this information and make economic decisions, but also personal decisions for you, and that your life will be better. And imagine that it were true. Okay, this is a thought experiment. Okay, so work with me. Imagine that it were true that your life would be better. In some objective sense, it would make better medical decisions for you and tell you who to hang out with and what you should talk about and what kind of job you should have and all your economic decisions. Okay, so that's the thought experiment. So the question is, would the government have the right to do so if it was able to make all these decisions for you? And I think as libertarians, it's extremely important for us to answer that resoundingly with no.
No.
That it's not just a matter of efficiency. It's not merely a matter of me being able to make better decisions for myself. that I have a right to make decisions for myself, even if I make dumb decisions.
Mm.
Now, I know that you never make dumb decisions, but sometimes I've been known to make mistakes, but they are mine to make. And importantly, I would add an element to this that you, Kate, and others have not just a right to make decisions for yourself, but an obligation that your life is yours. Your personal agency comes with a certain individual responsibility. And that is, in part, not merely a responsibility to behave yourself in public, but what I mean by that is you have a responsibility to our society and our culture, but to our humanity. You have a responsibility in my faith. You have a responsibility to your maker. You have a responsibility to that from which you came, your family and your culture. You have a responsibility, an obligation, a call of duty to live your life in a way that is in accordance with your own objectives, your own standards.
Mm.
It's not enough to say it's important for you to figure out the best ways of being successful. It must also be the case that it's up to you to define what success is, that it should be yours to decide, it is yours to decide, and you have an obligation to decide what it is that will determine how you feel about your own success. Proposition that a government, that a group cannot make, no matter how smart, that a group of people cannot make these decisions for you, that yours is your path to find, to discover, to determine, to lead, to live your life not only according to your own means and in the ways that you want, but in accordance with your own objectives and by your own standards. The reason I prattle on about this is because to the extent to which America believes in democracy, if that really is the source of what we claim is American exceptionalism, which of course is complete and utter bullshit, but to the extent to which anyone might even argue, well, we need to spread democracy, well, why is that? Why are you spreading freedom? Because part and parcel is that these peoples have not only a right to live their own lives, but an obligation to do so, an obligation that you are undermining. That what you're doing is not just a matter of inefficiency, but at a very deep and profound level, you are undermining the ethical proposition of these people leading their own lives. And so I would argue that the basic supposition that there could be such a thing as exceptionalism, American or Roman or ancient Greek or anybody else's, that very concept suggests that you're not living up to whatever the standard would need to be for there to exist such a concept. It is itself an oxymoron. It undermines its own reason for being.
Hmm. Wow, very big thought experiment. I'm still trying to get my head around a socialist society that actually works and everyone's happy, but I'll leave that to the side. Do you think that when you're out talking to people on the hustings, and I've run as a lead Senate candidate in the past for the Libertarian Party, so getting out in communities and talking to people, hearing their issues, do you think people realise the extent that government affects nearly every aspect of our daily lives? Do you think people realise just how hard poor government policy is making life for them? Or have they not made that connection yet? And is it also a case of people not wanting to accept personal responsibility and giving that power to the government and turning to the government to help? We have this culture in Australia, if there's ever any kind of problem, the first place people seem to turn to is the government to save us. So we'll print more money, we'll waste more money on government programs that never work. But there's this psyche in Australia now that we're not the self-reliant, laid-back, have-a-go culture. We turn to the government to help. We turn to the government to help. Is that similar in America? And what do you think is the solution to getting people to realise that you can be empowered to have control over your lives, and government is the one that is making life harder?
Yeah. I believe it is similar. Your description of it reminds me very much of the culture here. I do believe that we're psychologically moving in the right direction. I think people are awakening to the idea that you cannot trust your politicians, your bureaucrats, that these are people that make decisions that are not in your interest, that make decisions according to a set of values that do not align with your own. I think there is an awakening to that. But it's nowhere near where I believe it needs to be anywhere near in alignment with reality, right? Nor is it anywhere near where it needs to be for most Americans to vote for something that would help correct that, or to otherwise fight for our freedoms. I think we have a long ways to go. In this sense, I'm frequently asked about Javier Milei, right, in Argentina. He is an Austrian-trained economist. The parallels between his career and mine have not been lost on anyone in the Libertarian Party here. I get all that. Argentina is a nation that had the 5th highest per capita GDP in the world in the 1920s, 100 years ago. Has fallen so hard, right? Now we can see, strangely. We don't use that terminology anymore. We call it a developing nation. I wonder whether him coming to power is something that can only happen, right? Mm-hmm. After such a hard fall. We are testing the waters, as you are, optimistically believing that it's not true, that we can turn things around now, because our population is awakening, because people realize as we come through things like the COVID regime and how our government handled the pandemic, as we come through these things, a number of people are awakened, and we keep optimistically believing, surely now people will pick up the pitchfork, pick up the shovel. They will vote, they will complain, they will recognize. But I don't know that with any certainty. I worry.
I worry too. It keeps me up at night. I had an Argentinian economist, I can never say that right, on my show a few weeks ago, Melissa Albacetti, and I asked her, did she see Australia going down the same path as Argentina? And she said yes. And she said, I do not want to lose another country. So I want to fight to educate Australians about just how bad it can be when you let the government have all this power to print money, to have no accountability, to get in there with their left-wing ideology. So she's doing everything she can to help educate us. I also had your dear friend, Dr. Irene Mavrikakis, on my show, who I know is on your campaign team. Had a fantastic
Irene is a force of nature.
Oh, she's inspirational. And for her to come out during that time as a doctor and say, no, this is wrong. This is against our ethics. We should not be forcing any procedures on anyone. We need to respect bodily autonomy. It's a very brave woman. And I know as part of your campaign, you have a section in there on bodily autonomy. And does that also translate to the ability to use drugs? Because you're also passionate about reforming the war on drugs and the fact that that's failed from a policing sense. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on those two policies and what you would do to change how your country is dealing with those issues.
Yeah, I believe in the long run, the direction that we need to go is toward a complete decriminalization of all drugs. And I think that that's the case, both from the standpoint of the ethics involved, you know, the way we view this as libertarians, that the government should not have the authority to make decisions for you regarding what you can or cannot do with your body. whether that's a vaccine or drugs or anything else. But it is also the case, sadly, that what you see as a police officer is that as a practical matter, what we call the war on drugs is an abject failure. That the creation of black markets is a completely dangerous concept and is, in my view, the reason we lose over 100,000 young people every year to drug overdoses. The problem with fentanyl, for example, is not merely that fentanyl is very powerful, which it is, that it's a very dangerous drug. The more fundamental problem is that people don't know what it is that they're using when they use it, right? They don't have any control over the dosing and don't understand what it is that they're getting involved with. There is no, standardization of packaging or anything else. There's no testing available. All too often, young people don't even know that there's fentanyl in a variety of products that they're using. And so you can have it introduced without even knowing it, much less understanding the dosage. All of this is the result of the absence of what we would consider quite normal characteristics of any normal market, right? In any private sector controlled normal market, you would have control over dosing, not just drugs. I mean, sugar, anything. You know what it is that you're getting into. You know how to measure it and evaluate it. People test it. You have trusted providers. You have competitive providers. You have full disclosure. You've got third parties testing these products on the outside. None of which do you have in a black market. None of which do you have in the markets for these drugs. This is what makes them so dangerous. This is what makes them so dangerous. Not merely the fact that the drug itself is so powerful. It is front and center the absence of trusted providers that makes these markets so deadly. I think Americans recognize the ethical proposition, but I don't think most Americans would say that's very important. I think that most Americans would say, yeah, I get the idea that you ought to be able to make decisions for yourself, but given that most people can't make very good decisions, we're going to have to step in and make decisions for you. These drugs are killing people. They're obviously dangerous. And, that's all the evidence we need that you shouldn't be using them, and we're going to stop you. There is a certain logic there. I get all that. But as a practical matter, you've got to be able to wake up and say, it doesn't work. However you feel about the ethics, however I feel about the ethics. And so I'm getting back to the idea that, what if socialism worked? What if, the government were right? We would have a completely different proposition that the government should not have the right to make these decisions for you. From the fact that the government is not right. The government has created a black market, which has made this so dangerous. And that is where Americans just haven't arrived yet. And so I believe that the way this is likely to go is that we will have to complete the decriminalization and deregulation of marijuana. And then we will have to go stepwise. The next step will be the decriminalization and deregulation of other drugs that are not addictive. Give Americans an opportunity to find out that doesn't result in 1 million deaths, and then take it to the next step and move toward the decriminalization of drugs that are harder, that are more dangerous, that are addictive. That may take some time, but I do believe that is how this is going to evolve.
Well, you've seen that happen in Portugal. They decriminalised everything and they're a much happier, healthier society. So it does work. It's funny that they only choose the countries with the bad examples that suit their narrative to defend their policies, isn't it? We have that happen a lot here. But just on the back of that, as a police officer, and the war on drugs, it surprised me to hear how many Americans have been in jail because of possessing cannabis. That's still a criminal offense in some states over there. To me, that just seems crazy. What do you think as a police officer that you're spending all this money locking people up for a bit of weed? You're meant to be the land of the free.
That's the problem. It's enormously frustrating any way you look at it, from a law enforcement perspective included. Now, look, I had a good experience. I was able to find a police department with a separate vice unit, so I didn't have to get involved with all the stuff that I personally consider moronic. I didn't have to get involved with the war on drugs, for example. I didn't have to get involved with, we had a separate traffic unit. I didn't have to get involved with the quotas for traffic tickets to raise revenue for the community's local government, all the stuff that I personally consider stupid. I had a very good experience. But yes, law enforcement officers in the United States will tell you that it doesn't work. And I hasten to add, there's a growing recognition. And you may argue with me on this, but I assert that we have in the United States the world's most oppressive criminal justice system. We lock up far more people per capita than other nations do because of the war on drugs. Anything that is more than what state law would consider what you're likely to use personally over something like a week or two, you're labeled, if you're in possession of such an amount, you're labeled as a distributor, and you're going to do jail time. You're going to do jail time. It's really included. So it's a real challenge. I really believe it's an ethical problem. I think the United States population, we have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, do we really believe in freedom if we're locking up this many people in jail?
Now, talking of freedom, one of the big ways we can be free is if we have our own control over our money. And your country has screwed us all over by leaving the gold-backed currency behind. I have read my history books. I know it's your country's fault. What are we going to do? You've got this policy of the Gold New Deal. You want to go back to gold-backed currency, and how do you think Bitcoin crypto fit in the mix with that? Because I really like Safadine Amos and the way he's selling Bitcoin as a solution, because it's deregulated. No government can have control. I also heard you say in a podcast I was listening to this morning that your monetary policy is controlled by a system where a dozen people get in a room, and it depends what mood they're in, depends on the way the interest rates go. It's the same in Australia. It is terrifying. It is affecting our lives. We have a crazy inflation crisis here. So your solution to that is gold-backed currency. Is that right?
And by the way, that's not even a metaphor. That's actually how it happens, is that we ask 12 people every 6 weeks how they feel about the economy and what they think interest rates ought to be. It's absolutely stunning. I think that if the populations of Australia and America understood that's how it works, they would realize that is, but I don't think most people have any appreciation for that whatsoever. I don't think we need to go all the way back to a gold standard. I think that we need to get off of this idea of relying on a central bank to set policy with complete discretion. I believe that we need a rule, a law, capping how much money they can issue. I would sunset the Federal Reserve System lock, stock, and barrel for a variety of reasons, this being the big one, that we need to get away from a central bank with discretionary authority to create more money. We can't have it. We just can't have it. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to go all the way back to a gold standard. We don't have research that suggests that a deflationary environment would be any healthier for us. It would have different problems, but it's not obvious that a deflationary environment would be any healthier than an inflationary environment. I believe that we ought to have a system that targets 0% inflation. And to achieve that, I think that we need a rule in place that says we will not allow the money supply to increase any faster than economic activity. In other words, targeting a zero inflation rate. Today, the Federal Reserve System, as you may know, targets a 2% inflation rate, which is 2% too high. It's dopey. It's a political construct, not an economic one. And the Federal Reserve allows itself to miss that target all the time. As you know, we're coming off of a period during which we had 1 year when it was over 7% inflation, just absolutely out of control. So we do need fundamental change in the monetary policy. I don't know that we need to go all the way back to a gold standard, but we need to firm up the dollar. Yes, we need competitive currencies. I believe that the leading example will likely be Bitcoin. But I don't believe that we should tolerate a government biasing Bitcoin to beat out other digital currencies. There's no reason why Ethereum and other currencies shouldn't be competing for primacy. We need to keep the Federal Reserve System out of the business of issuing its own digital currency, which would be an utter disaster, both in terms of privacy as well as in terms of biasing the development of these markets in its own favor and undermining the development of Bitcoin and Ethereum and other blockchain-based technologies around the world as well. We can't have it. We can't have a system where the Fed is guessing the appropriate characteristics of a digital currency that we're going to need for the advent of the smart economy in another decade, guessing wrong, and nonetheless biasing the development of these markets in its favor. We can't have that. So we need to get the Fed out of the currency business, except for the dollar, the Fed out of the business of the dollar as well, because they've screwed that up. So I believe that we need to sunset the Federal Reserve System completely. And to your point regarding Australian money, we need for the federal government of the United States to be out of the business of crushing other currencies, which it does by controlling transaction mechanisms, clearinghouses, international rules about transactions, about oil trading, futures trading. Every international market, the Treasury Department of the federal government of the United States has its hand in it, making rules more difficult for other currencies. And this is not something that we should be tolerating.
So how's your campaign going? What's it like running with the Libertarian Party? I've got some stories. I need a drink to tell you over. But what's it like? Are they coming along for the ride with you? I know you've got some big competitors, Chase Oliver. I have to admit, I'm a member of the emo caucus. I'm part of that little faction, but I love your shoes.
I love that.
I love the shoes that you put out. I saw you design some shoes. The emo chat was going nuts, saying they're very emo, look like Connie's or Vans. So how's the campaign going? How are you feeling? How's the party? How's everything happening going over there?
There's a lot to unpack there. In order, it's going well. I would be lying if I said it were not going well. It's going very, very. Our team does expect to secure the nomination in May. That's not to say that there's not a lot of work between now and the end of May, right? We have another 4 weeks of a tremendous amount of work, but there's no reason for our team not to be optimistic about how things are going. And I think that that's because most of our party recognizes that two pillars of our campaign are the pillars that we want to be underpinning the campaign representing the party going forward. A very principles forward platform, what we call the Gold New Deal, and maintaining a great deal of credibility. Leaning on my own personal background in economics and in law enforcement, we back up our credibility and cautiously protect it at every turn, because we believe that there is a threshold of credibility that voters and big donors and media expect to be cleared to pay any attention. And that's what we want. We want to actually participate competitively, credibly competitively in the American political landscape. We want to fundamentally change it by participating in it and creating a disruption to the way that the duopolistic system is able to disregard us. And we believe that if we run the kind of campaign that our team is capable of, we will disrupt their ability to disregard us. They will be for our party, our campaign, our principles, our platform, our values. This is the object of the game. This is the object of the game. And to do that, we need to run on a very differentiated platform, one that does not get mixed up with Republicans or Democrats, that offers a clean, clear, differentiated choice. And I'm optimistic that Americans are going to react very, very well to that. So, the answer to your question is everything is going well. It's going according to plan, to the extent to which you can plan any of this. It has been well received. You're right. We do have other competitors that are terrific in each his own way. Chase Oliver and Michael Rechtenwald and Lars Mapstead, each of whom I stay in touch with. We see each other every weekend. They are marvelous in each their own respective ways. And I've enjoyed working with them enormously. And I believe that to no small extent, we will remain a team irrespective of who the nominee is, because everyone does have a certain talent and a certain talent pool to draw on. And I think that we all recognize that this is an opportunity for the Libertarian Party. But Kate, I would argue, it's an obligation for us to get this right. It's a call of duty. And so we have to present as a unified force. That there has been plenty of divisiveness inside the Libertarian Party of the United States. Plenty, right? I think a lot of that comes from a frustration over a lack of success. Organizations, especially nonprofits, when they're not focused on a unifying objective, a unifying definition of what success looks like, minds wander, right? We lose focus, and that's when the infighting starts, particularly in a nonprofit organization, particularly in a political organization. And so I think that pursuing an objective which is large but doable, and an objective requiring all hands on deck, that's going to bring our party together in a way that we have not been together for decades.
Unification among the libertarians. I would love to see that. We have similar struggles in Australia, but we're all so smart. We all have our own ideas about how we're going to achieve our principles, and it's just about working together. We're terrible at collectivizing, collectivist action. I think that's part of us. We want to do our own things. Don't tell me what to do, but we have to, because liberty and libertarianism is the answer to all of these problems that we face in my country and your country. And on that note, if we wake up after the election in November and we have a libertarian president and it's you, what's the first thing that you would do? Now I'm taking you to a dreamland. What's the first thing you would do?
I think that's terrific. You've got to start out with the things that a libertarian-minded administration can do relatively unilaterally. And so I think that you've got to focus on foreign policy right away. You've got to make a number of phone calls, for example, to European heads of state. And that conversation goes something like this. This is your 18-month heads up. Whatever was your plan B, it's now your plan A. Because we do not consider it an ethical proposition for this administration to take money away from Americans and use it to project military hegemony. We are going to be exiting from NATO. If you believe that it is in your interest to spend 2 or 3% of GDP on defense because you remain, I would argue, slightly paranoid of the Russian army, notwithstanding what we have learned about the Russians' inability to overrun even Ukraine, then you do you. start spending the money now, because the United States is going to be exiting a relationship in which we're obliged to back you up, whether we believe it's in our personal interest or not. We're going to be sending signals right away that we're unwinding our commitment to investments in Taiwan. We're going to be unwinding our commitments to foreign aid around the world, including the Middle East, including Israel. And for a lot of us, Israel feels different. We have strong emotional ties to Israel for a lot of good reasons. I've traveled Israel. I've traveled the Palestinian territory. I've sent my daughter to events in Israel. I've sent my son to train in Jordan. I've traveled all over the Middle East. And as a matter of faith, a lot of us have connections to the Holy Land. I understand Israel feels different, but it has to remain that as a matter of principle, we should not be intertwining our foreign policy with anyone else's. We should not be held responsible for decisions made by other governments and vice versa. And by the way, I do believe that the Israeli government is learning and will conclude before this year is out that it is not obvious that the relationship with the American government is completely in the interest of the Israeli people as well. I think they're going to be rethinking that. So a lot of change in foreign policy right away. And then, one more thing, we're going to be replacing the leadership at the Fed so that we end this discretionary monetary policy, which is the first step toward ending the Fed completely. We're going to be pushing legislation to cap spending and vetoing anything that does not contribute toward controlling spending. Making, through executive order, much federal regulation subject to the approval of local state governors, so that states will have an opportunity to stand up against the federal government and chart their own political futures. And I think that's very, very important.
Fantastic, Mike. Well, thank you so much for joining me on my show. You've got to come down under. You've got to get down here. We're a beautiful country. We're just run by a pack of morons at the moment, but I think that's a universal feeling. But you're welcome down here anytime. And
Thank you.
Best wishes with your campaign. I'm a huge fan, and I've got to come over to the States. I've got my taxes theft dress, which I wore at my campaign launch. I'm a little bit more spicy than you. I go really out there with my stuff. But it's great to see that you've got that, the campaign, a credible campaign, and you come across like a statesman. And it's been a long time since I've spoken to a politician or a candidate that has that statesman feel. So it's an absolute honor to finally get to chat to you. And thank you so much for coming on my show. Is there anything else you want to add for anyone listening?
Oh, my goodness, Kate, it's absolutely my honor and my pleasure. Thank you for having had Irene on your show in the past. I do believe that you need to get Irene down there lickety split, but not before November, because we need her. And then in 2026, my wife Nancy and I are going to come down there and see you. And I look forward to you being up here sometime in the next year or so, because I think that would, for us as well as for you, but I think that would help drive home the point for Americans that these are shared interests, shared values, shared challenges, and that together we can recognize them and therefore overcome them.
Amen. And we'll have a few beers, whether we're there or in your country.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks for listening, everyone. My name's Kate Fantanell, Lady Liberty. You can find me on X, Lady Liberty Australia, Facebook, and of course my YouTube show, Shooting the Breeze with Lady Liberty.